Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really critical question for Bitcoin. Can its Lightning Network truly scale up for mass adoption?
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
You've sent in some really interesting material, and we're going to dissect this clash of ideas between two, well, prominent voices here.
Definitely.
Our mission, really, is to get past maybe the super technical weeds and just grasp the core arguments, for and against the Lightning Network, getting Bitcoin ready for potentially billions of users.
Exactly. We've got Matthew Crowder's piece from Bitcoin University. Has the Lightning Network failed?
Mm.
And it's basically a direct response to Jordan McKinn's concerns.
McKinn's worries about fundamental limits, right?
Right. McKinn argues it just can't scale. So it's a classic point-counterpoint setup. Should be good to get into.
All right, let's jump right in then. McKinn's argument. What's his main concern about Lightning's ability to scale?
Well, McKinn's core point is pretty stark. He essentially says the Lightning Network as it stands structurally cannot handle mass global adoption.
Okay, why? What's the reasoning?
His logic is really tied to the Bitcoin base layer itself, the blockchain.
The main chain, yeah. The bottleneck there.
Exactly. McKinn highlights that the Bitcoin blockchain has this fundamental limit on how many transactions it can process. It's around, 158 million transactions per year, roughly?
Which sounds like a lot, but maybe not for the whole world.
Precisely. That limit, which is, a deliberate design choice for security and decentralization, that's the heart of the scalability problem he sees.
Right.
If you imagine billions of people needing to interact with Bitcoin, even just to open and close Lightning channels on that base layer, well, 158 million a year starts to look pretty insufficient, drastically so.
Okay, so that's the base layer constraint. How does that connect directly to his worry about Lightning then?
Well, his big fear is that because base layer space is so limited and potentially expensive, the vast majority of people won't be able to run their own Lightning channels directly.
So they have to rely on
custodial solutions.
Yeah.
Third parties holding their Bitcoin and managing channels for them. And he calls this paper Bitcoin. His argument is that this fundamentally breaks Bitcoin's promise of scarcity.
How so? Paper Bitcoin.
Because if most Bitcoin isn't actually held by individuals on the network, but exists as IOUs on the books of these custodians.
Right, like a bank ledger.
Yeah, exactly. He argues it weakens the hard cap of 21 million coins. It introduces systemic risk, kind of like the old fractional reserve banking problems.
Yeah.
Potential for failure, runs on custodians, that sort of thing.
That's a pretty serious charge against the whole scaling approach. So McKinn paints a fairly grim picture. How does Crowder push back?
Well, what's really interesting is where Crowder starts. He points out the irony of the timing, or rather the current state of the Bitcoin network in 2025.
Okay, what's the irony?
The network isn't actually jammed up like McKinn fears. It's quite the opposite. Some blocks are apparently being mined only half full.
Wait, really? So it's underutilized right now, not overwhelmed?
Exactly. Which Crowder finds ironic, given McKinn's concerns about future congestion. He even mentions other critics, like Jacob King, who are apparently saying Bitcoin is, quote, dying from underuse.
Dying from underuse, calling it a hollow Ponzi scheme. Wow.
Yeah, pointing to empty blocks, lack of demand. So Crowder's looking at these two criticisms, future overload versus current underuse, and saying, hang on, these are contradictory, aren't they?
They definitely seem to be pulling in opposite directions, like complaining the restaurant is too crowded and nobody goes there anymore. It's too crowded.
Exactly. A good analogy. And Crowder uses this contradiction to lead into another point about the whole debate around Bitcoin fees, using the midwit meme.
The meme. Okay, I think I know the one. How does he apply it here?
Well, he lays out the two common opposing complaints about Bitcoin fees. You've got one camp saying fees are way too high.
Pricing out the little guy, right.
Yeah.
Making small payments impossible on-chain.
Yes. And then you've got the other camp arguing the opposite. Fees are actually too low.
Too low? Why would that be a problem?
Their concern is that if fees are too low, it weakens the long-term security budget for miners, especially after the block subsidy diminishes over time, undermining the incentive to secure the network.
Okay, so high fees bad, low fees also bad. Opposing viewpoints again.
Right. And Crowder's take is that this isn't really a sign of failure. It's more like, well, it's a necessary tension. A balancing act that's always happening in a decentralized system like this.
So finding the right fee level is like a constant adjustment, not a fixed target.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's dynamic, part of how the network functions, not some fundamental flaw that needs a single fix.
That makes sense. And, it's worth remembering these kinds of scaling worries aren't exactly new for Bitcoin, are they? Crowder mentions the history.
Oh, absolutely. He
Yeah.
makes a point of saying that people have been worried about Bitcoin scaling almost since day one.
Really? Like back in 2008?
Yeah, he says literally 3 days after Satoshi dropped the white paper, people were already questioning if it could handle global scale. So seeing the current debate in that long historical context, it maybe makes it seem less like a sudden crisis and more like, well, an ongoing challenge in Bitcoin's evolution.
Right, part of the process. Now, Crowder doesn't just stick to Bitcoin. He brings Ethereum into it too, and I gather he's not exactly a fan.
That's putting it mildly. Yeah, he draws a really sharp contrast. He's quite critical of Ethereum's design choices. He calls its foundation sand, basically.
Wait, foundation of sand. Why?
He points to things like its history of frequent hard forks, which he sees as fundamentally changing its monetary policy. And he's critical of the switch to proof of stake as well.
Okay, so philosophical differences. What about technologically?
He's quite skeptical of Ethereum's smart contracts, calls them complex Rube Goldberg machines, prone to hacks and bugs.
Vulnerability.
Yes. And he also brings up centralization risks, especially around running nodes. The reliance on big providers like Infura, for instance. He sees that as a potential weak point.
So his overall picture is Ethereum's base layer is maybe complex and potentially less secure.
Compared to Bitcoin, yes. He frames Ethereum's layer 1 as potentially bloated and insecure, whereas he sees Bitcoin's base layer as simple and robust.
Okay, that definitely sets up his defense of Lightning. So how does he explain Lightning actually working for Bitcoin scaling?
Right. He breaks it down quite clearly. The basic idea, as we touched on, is moving most of the actual payment traffic off the main blockchain.
Okay, how does that start?
It starts when two users open a payment channel. This requires just one transaction on the main Bitcoin blockchain on layer 1. He calls this an economically dense transaction.
Economically dense, meaning?
Meaning the cost of that one layer 1 transaction gets spread out or amortized over potentially thousands or millions of transactions that happen later inside the channel. It makes the layer 1 fee worthwhile.
Okay, so you pay once on-chain to open the channel, then what?
Then inside that open channel, the users can send Bitcoin back and forth between themselves almost instantly, and with like near zero fees. Millions of microtransactions potentially, all happening off-chain.
Off-chain, got it. No burden on the main blockchain for those.
Exactly. And then, when they're done, or want to settle the net result, they close the channel. And that closing also requires just one more transaction back on layer 1.
So one transaction to open, one to close, and potentially tons of payments in between.
Precisely. That final closing transaction just records the net change in their balances on the main blockchain. It summarizes all that off-chain activity.
So the main chain only sees the setup and the settlement, not the flurry of payments inside.
That's the core idea of the economic density. The layer 1 fees are justified because they enable this huge volume of off-chain activity very cheaply.
Makes sense.
Now, Crowder is careful to say Lightning isn't, a magic bullet. It's not perfect.
Yeah.
But he argues it's a very effective and practical scaling strategy for Bitcoin.
Does he compare it to scaling on other chains?
He does draw a parallel to things like Ethereum rollups, acknowledging they're also a form of layered scaling. But he maintains Bitcoin's simple, secure base layer provides a stronger foundation for this layered approach.
Okay, but what about McKinn's big worry, the forced reliance on custodians? How does Crowder handle that? That seemed like McKinn's main objection.
Right, and this is where Crowder offers a bit more nuance. He doesn't just dismiss all custodians out of hand. No, he suggests maybe not all custodians are created equal. He gives an example like River, which is a Bitcoin custodian that uses proof of reserves.
Proof of reserves, meaning they try to prove they actually hold the Bitcoin?
Yeah, it offers users more transparency, a way to verify solvency, which is a step up from just trusting blindly. But even more interestingly, he talks about Fedimints.
Fedimints. Okay, what are those? Sounds different.
They're described as community-run, trust-minimized custodial banks. The key words there are community-run and trust-minimized.
How do they work? How are they trust-minimized?
Well, the idea is they use clever cryptography, like blind signatures. Users can hold Bitcoin IOUs issued by a federation of guardians, but the guardians themselves can't see the individual user balances or transactions. It preserves privacy and reduces the level of trust needed compared to a single centralized custodian.
Interesting. So more decentralized custody.
Kind of. The goal is to get the convenience of a custodian, especially for smaller, day-to-day amounts, but without the huge centralization risks and single points of failure of traditional models. Crowder suggests that these kinds of solutions, maybe Fedimints or similar ideas, working alongside the Lightning Network, that could be a pragmatic path forward.
So a combination, Lightning for fast, cheap payments, and maybe these community banks for holding smaller amounts conveniently but with less trust.
That seems to be the picture he's painting, a layered approach involving both the tech like Lightning and potentially new, more decentralized forms of custody.
Okay, so if we were to sort of wrap up Crowder's main concluding points.
Sure. He basically starts by agreeing that, yes, base layer blockchains don't scale well natively, Bitcoin included. That's hard.
So he concedes that point to McKinn.
He agrees on the problem, yes. The need for layers is real. But he fundamentally disagrees on the solution and the diagnosis. He firmly believes Bitcoin's layered architecture, with the secure base and solutions like Lightning on top, is sound, both secure and economically viable.
And he thinks Lightning, plus maybe these newer custodial models, can actually deliver the needed scale.
Yes. He expresses confidence in Lightning and what he calls honest custodians, offering real scalability pathways.
Contrasting sharply with his view of Ethereum's approach.
Right. He sees Ethereum as having made different trade-offs, potentially sacrificing some immutability and simplicity for speed or features. He ultimately frames Bitcoin's slower, more deliberate development as a strength.
A feature, not a bug, for monetary soundness and decentralization.
Exactly. That's his core stance.
Okay, wow. So let's quickly recap where we've been. We started with McKinn's pretty significant concerns about the Bitcoin base layer's transaction limits.
Yep, the 158 million per year cap.
And his fear that this forces users onto potentially risky paper Bitcoin custodial solutions.
Undermining scarcity and adding systemic risk.
Then we pivoted to Crowder's rebuttal, highlighting the current underutilization of the network.
The irony of blocks being half empty while people worry about congestion.
The midwit meme view of the fee debate as a constant balancing act.
Fees too high versus fees too low.
Releasing scaling worries in historical context.
Not a new problem, been around since '08.
His sharp critique of Ethereum's design choices.
Foundation of sand, complex contracts, centralization risks.
And then his defense of Lightning, explaining how it works by moving transactions off-chain.
The whole open channel, off-chain payments, closed channel process, economic density.
And finally, his more nuanced take on custody, mentioning proof of reserves and especially these Fedimints.
As a potential part of a pragmatic, more decentralized scaling future.
Right. So I think we've definitely covered the ground, mapping out those core arguments like we set out to do. We've seen the clash of perspectives on Lightning's viability.
Absolutely. We've gone through McKinn's structural critique and Crowder's defense based on layered scaling and evolving custodial models. Hopefully that gives a much clearer picture of this whole crucial debate.
Yeah, for you, the listener, we hope this deep dive has kind of given you a shortcut through what can be a really complex, sometimes heated discussion about where Bitcoin is heading. You've heard the main points from both sides now.
In thinking about all this, it really brings up a bigger question, maybe something for you to chew on after this. What are the fundamental trade-offs when it comes to scaling any blockchain?
Yeah. Beyond just Bitcoin or Ethereum.
Right. When you push for massive scale, what potentially gets sacrificed? Is it decentralization? Is it security? Is it the simplicity of the base layer? How do different approaches, whether it's Lightning rollups or something else entirely, navigate those trade-offs?
That's a really important question. There's probably no single right answer, is there?
Likely not. It's about understanding the choices being made and their long-term implications. Something to definitely keep thinking about as this whole space keeps evolving.